I'd like to welcome everyone to this session of the Association for Baha'i Studies. And the title of our session tonight is A New Balance and New Direction, reflecting on the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs Advancing Together Symposium. My name is Ken Bowers, and I'll be serving as the chair for this session. And our presenters this evening are PJ Andrews and May Lample. PJ and May are the race discourse officers at the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs. And in this role, they coordinate the office's collaboration with individuals, organizations, and agencies in the United States engaged in public discourse and policy advocacy directed toward racial justice and racial unity. And the two of them have been serving in this role for just under 4 years. Now, friends, this is a live session, and our hope is that after May and PJ offer a presentation, that there will still be ample opportunity for exchange and for conversation based on the ideas that we'll hear from them. So just to give you an idea of the flow, we're thinking that about the first half hour will be devoted to their presentation, and approximately the second half hour will be dedicated to conversation with you. And we hope that many of you will feel inspired to offer your observations and experiences and comments. Now, for those of you familiar with Zoom, you know that this is a live session, and what you can do if you wish to speak is you can use the raise hand function at the bottom right of your screen. That should be where it's located, and then we can recognize you and unmute you to ask your question or to make whatever comment or observation you'd like. And we'd also like to ask a few other things of you, our guests. First, if you would please make sure that your name is in the Zoom sign-in, and we hope that you'll not go anonymous or use fanciful sign-ins. We hope that in the conversation portion, as a courtesy to others who may wish to speak, that you'll please keep your questions or comments concise and to the point. And of course, naturally, we hope that everyone will exercise courtesy in their comments, either to our presenters or to each other. And we are sure that on this, we'll have a pleasant and productive experience for everyone. So May and PJ have asked me to say a few words just to provide a little bit of context for their remarks. In May of 1921, the American Baha'i community hosted a national conference on race amity in Washington, D.C. This conference was attended by around 2,500 people, and it was a significant event that reflected the community's deep commitment to the cause of racial unity and justice. In the 100 years since then, the Baha'is in the United States have been involved in many significant ways in addressing the issue of racial unity, and of course, in too many ways for us to describe here. But a new phase of activity at the U.S. Office of Public Affairs was initiated at the request of the Universal House of Justice, which several years ago asked all national spiritual assemblies to identify important areas of public discourse in which they thought they might have a significant impact over the course of time by contributing ideas and concepts from the Baha'i teachings, as well as sharing our experience in applying those teachings. Not surprisingly, the House of Justice also emphasized that such an approach would entail a process of capacity building over the course of a number of years. Now, the National Assembly of the United States soon determined that the chief issue for America is racial justice, racial unity. Of course, this is a belief that is supported and is central to the writings of the Baha'i faith. But of course, there's also a lively and urgent discourse on the issue of race in the United States as well. Now, this year, on the 100th anniversary of that first Race Amity Conference, the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs held a virtual symposium titled Advancing Together, Forging a Path Toward a Just, Inclusive, and Unified Society, for people of diverse backgrounds to reflect on the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. That symposium represented a significant milestone in the office's efforts to contribute to this discourse. And tonight, what we want to do is to take a look at what went into the visioning and planning of that symposium. And we'll reflect on major insights that resulted and consider them in the context of the long-range process being pursued by the Office of Public Affairs. So now to May and PJ, perhaps we could begin the discussion tonight by asking you to say a little bit more about your objectives and aims in contributing to the national discourse on race.
Thanks, Ken. Yes, and welcome everyone. We're so glad to be here, and we're really, actually, just before I answer the question from Ken, just so honored that he chose to do this with us. So in our work, we're the outward-facing. The Office of Public Affairs is the outward-facing office of the National Spiritual Assembly. We sort of try and be the voice of the American Baha'i community to the wider society on the national level, but we really serve at the pleasure of the National Spiritual Assembly, and are very lucky and blessed to be guided by them, and particularly closely guided by Ken, who really works hand in hand with us over the last 4 years. So I just want to offer that note of gratitude and recognition to both Ken and the National Spiritual Assembly in supporting our work and guiding us. So yeah, I think the one way to look at the objectives of our office is actually embedded in the title of our presentation tonight. So when we were getting ready and preparing sort of our opening remarks, May actually came across a quote from Elsie Austin, who served as a member of the National Spiritual Assembly. I believe, I could be wrong, as the first African-American woman of the National Spiritual Assembly, and also as a pioneer, and has a storied history in contributing to the faith. But in 1944, she said, "It is not that colored peoples need this or that, it's not that colored peoples need this or that white people need that. It is rather that all men, all races, all classes, all creeds, and all nations are in need of a new balance and a new direction for this day." So I think in some ways that was a goal of our symposium, but also a goal of our work. I think broadly, we are seeking to create conditions for like-minded actors to contribute to a national conversation on race that is characterized by a new language that will allow thought to advance towards constructive action. And I think that that's just important to recognize in a discourse on race, and the discourse on race in America, which is sort of characterized by division, conflict, contention, and very sort of strong emotions, and maybe like a lot of moral camps, like that a lot of side taking, a lot of us and them. So it's really hard. You feel like it's a lot of people talking past each other. And so I think one of the main objectives of our work is to create conditions, really like try and creating social spaces where people can come together. And somebody once described it like there's a rainstorm. The discourse is a rainstorm. It's kind of hard to get your bearings. And we're trying to create a space where you can kind of put up an umbrella and quiet the storm a little bit and have a conversation to really advance thought and language. And I think it's also important to recognize that when we talk about our work, we often say that, when you look at book 5 and the power of expression as a goal of the junior youth program, you also think about how there's this intimate connection between language and consciousness, thought and action. And that as language and consciousness evolves, so does our ability to act in the way that we choose to act. So we don't see this work of contributing to the advancement of thought and language at the national level as divorced from or something separate from the work going on at the grassroots, but actually they really inform each other. And so I think, just to kind of put that out there, and then maybe just one other point to make is that, I think generally speaking, the work that we try and do is maybe to rise above the important work or go deeper than the important work of sort of specific policy and policy objectives or legislative gains or goals. That work is very important, but as contributing to a national conversation like this, we recognize that we as Baha'is, we have sort of a very long-term vision of change, and that the requirements of that change are ultimately moral and spiritual. And so then a lot of what our work is trying to unearth the assumptions that underpin a lot of the conversations unfolding in society, and create space to really think deeply and reflect on those assumptions, and then try and bring to bear some of those spiritual principles that might help us move forward on a more enduring path to peace and tranquility in society. So I think there's a lot of the work that you'll hear in terms of what we did at the symposium, it was trying to get to a little bit deeper level. And I think it's important just to acknowledge that that is the purpose of the work, that and it's not in conflict with or dismissive. Sorry, dismissive is the word, of the work of policy and legislation, which is incredibly important. But in terms of laying a foundation for a restructuring of society that is found on the oneness of humanity and justice, we try and create conditions to really explore what will allow us to move in that direction. I don't know if May wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. Essentially, I think that as Baha'is, we're well familiar with the idea that the work of social transformation, of creating a world that really works for all of its inhabitants, requires us to look outside. This requires the work outside of the Baha'i community. It's not just the Baha'is that are going to bring this about. And so really it's like in this work of participation and discourse that we're really, I mean, in all of our areas of activity, but especially in participation and discourse, we're really walking shoulder to shoulder with those from wider society who have experience trying to create conditions for social transformation. And I think it's already been shared during this conference, but Shoghi Effendi called the Baha'i community that we should act as a leaven for the world. So that's something that our office also tries to do. And what does that mean? Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. How can we act as a leaven to create these conditions that allow for society to seek solutions for the problems that seem to be plaguing us? So I just wanted to add that also.
Thank you. Now, one of the things you've emphasized for a long time and that we've long understood is that the symposium was, in a certain sense, developed over the course of several years. And you're seeing it as a milestone in a process of building capacity to make the contributions that you've just described. And so, can you say something about why that was an important distinction and approach? In other words, why a process orientation rather than an event orientation? And could you say a little bit more about the elements of that process?
Sure. I think this orientation, trying to think around a process versus an event, will be something that's very familiar to all of us who are, trying to work in these areas of activity of the Baha'i community. And really for us at like the most simple level, like this distinction between these two orientations like changed our entire approach to the symposium. If it was simply an event, it was something that we could, PJ and I were hired at the end of 2017. We could have essentially like had an event right away that brought people together and invited people. But really our office had been participating in the discourse on race prior to PJ and I being hired. The Baha'i community has been engaging in this discourse for a long time. And so it's not as if we came on and created something that didn't build. I mean, I think thinking in terms of a process also had us connected to the history of this work, and it recognizes that this work is long-term, that it requires a long-term effort until we really see racism eradicated from our society. And so thinking of it in terms of a process allowed us to recognize the past of where we've been and also to think into the future of where we're going. And I think also it allowed us to think of our work in terms of a process rather than just like, we're going to have a series of events and that will be how we do our work. But really, this idea of participation and discourse has a number of different processes embedded within it. So, learning to read society in light of the revelation of Baha'u'llah and trying to build relationships with others, and really learning to articulate some principles and our experience, the experience of the Baha'i community in trying to establish those principles in a way that's relevant to the current discourse are all processes that we had to engage in order to see in order to have really an effective symposium. That really essentially the symposium for us was a milestone in work that we had been engaged in for about almost 3.5 years, where we were going to different spaces and meeting people, deepening relationships with them, where we had a chance to think about what are some specific principles from the faith that we can apply to this discourse, and what is actually happening in this discourse. How can we be constructive contributors to a discourse of social transformation around the issue of the elimination of racism? So process orientation really allowed us to do all of those things and really shaped the way that we approached the symposium. And we can talk a little bit more about that. PJ, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think just in thinking about the symposium and how it related to what was being developed over the course of several years and this process orientation, in some ways it was like a coming together of many conversations that we were having with different people. So in a way, we almost looked at it as like a reflection gathering, like bringing like a pulsating heartbeat that brought together a lot of ideas, a lot of our thoughts and conversations with really thoughtful people into one space. And then we're sort of now trying to figure out where does that blood flow into to moving our work forward. And so I think, we'll get into some of the particulars about how we envisioned it, but just wanted to add that point about this idea of it being a culmination of many conversations, but how we can see it, as an inflection point that maybe comes and goes throughout the course of our time contributing to this discourse.
Thank you. Before we get to the actual symposium itself and who participated and what you learned from that, I'd like to just explore a little bit more something that I think May was referring to, which was this question, which I think was stated, of capacity building. So that's emphasized in just about everything that we do these days as Baha'is, in our community building effort, in our engagement in social action. And so it might be interesting then to think a little bit about what capacities were important to you in developing to do this work leading up to the symposium, and how were they brought to bear in the development of the actual coming together that you just described.
Yeah, I think if we think about some of these capacities, I think first and foremost, it's the ability to really bring people together. So something that we really were striving for in this process is we wanted to, how do you create a space which allows us to move beyond this idea of like these moral tribes that are essentially like pitted against each other. And when you engage in a conversation, you don't like move beyond your own thinking, but really it's just about trying to prove your point. So we wanted to have people represented at the symposium that had a diversity of thought. So they were unified in their understanding that, our society is plagued by racism, and this is a social ill that we need to eliminate, but they might not necessarily all agree with each other and what is the best way of doing that. So even things around like theories of social change and theories of human nature, they might not necessarily all have agreed with each other 100%, but that they would be willing to have an exchange. And also if we thought, like, we had about 6 panels, and we really wanted it to be seen as one continuous conversation that approached these issues from different perspectives. And so just to share a little bit more about, what it was exactly that we talked about during the symposium, which required essentially the capacity to like read reality. What was it that what was the contribution we wanted to make to a national discourse on race? 2 themes that really we wanted to touch on were participation and social transformation. And so the way that those are rather big themes, but the way that we wanted to do that is really by posing questions that the panelists could speak around. And so in a way that wasn't like dictatorial, like you have to speak this way, but let's explore concepts together. So I just thought, like, really briefly, I could pull up those questions. Oops, this is it. This is what I want. And so the questions were, how can we foster conditions across this nation to which growing numbers from all racial backgrounds will be attracted to participate in constructive action on a path toward racial justice? And how can we develop language and narratives that welcome and encourage a growing number of people from all segments of society to embrace the cause of racial justice and play their part, no matter how humble? In our methods and approaches, how can we advance the cause of justice within a framework that recognizes our interconnectedness as noble human actors and thus values diversity and inclusion? How can the moral and spiritual roots of human motivation be translated into concrete expressions of constructive agency and practice? And finally, in light of the preceding questions, what are distinctive challenges and opportunities of this collective moment in America? And how can it best be seized to reshape social relationships and advance the cause of justice? So we really wanted to take these themes. Sorry, I'll just stop sharing. We really wanted to take these larger themes of participation in social justice, but also speak about them in a way that is relevant to a national level discourse on racial justice and unity. And so, the idea was, so that when we invited our panelists to speak, we shared these questions with them, and essentially, because we had been developing relationships with most of these panelists for years, we kind of took a leap of faith that we knew, because we knew them and we knew, we were familiar with the framework that they were operating, that we felt that they were going to have something to share that was also relevant to that was in line with our own thinking and the kind of contribution that we want to make as Baha'is to this discourse. And we were not surprised, but joyfully able to see that conversation unfold. And some of the themes that the friends were able to share, some of the that repeatedly came up with, not much prompting for us, although of course the questions sought to help to frame this conversation. Friends, the panelists shared often about our shared humanity, really touching on this idea that if we want to work to eliminate racism, we have to have a recognition of our shared humanity. And there were a lot of points about like what it is that motivates people to participate in social transformation, and how do we tap the roots of that motivation. I think also something that came up a lot was the need to and the importance of trying to build something that's enduring, that will take us as a society to the next level and move beyond just like sort of triaging a variety of social ills, but really allow us to flourish as individuals and as a society, and sort of address these longstanding social ills. And then also many spoke about the need and the role of initiating and seeing spiritual principles come into action and developing moral capabilities. But I'll let PJ speak to some more of the capacities that we tried to build.
Sure, and I don't know, Ken, if you wanted to ask another question, but I can keep going. It's up to you.
Well, I think a couple more things might be in order. I mean, it would be interesting to just hear a little bit more about the exchange that you had on these questions. And a question that I have is, did you learn from the exchange? In other words, it's the idea is to advance the discourse. Do you feel as though you came away enriched by the experience? And in what way? And do you have an indication that they also benefited, and that together there is a new level of thought beginning to emerge among all of the people who were at the symposium? And you might want to just say, the breakdown of, who some of those people were, so we get a sense of who the participants were.
Yeah, and we'll put some links in the chat for people to explore this further. I just put in the link to the website, which was which in and of itself we feel is like a contribution to the discourse. It was an expression. It was very thoughtfully prepared on our end, so I think it's worth reading through how we frame things. And so yeah, I mean, I think that we talked earlier about how this was done collaboratively, and I think, and also how May was saying that really we are trying to walk shoulder to shoulder with people from the wider society who are part of this conversation. And so there are 6 panels over the course of 3 days, 2 days, 2 panels per day. And I think the breakdown was like 50-50, wider society and Baha'is. Now the first, and there was one panel that was completely our friends from the wider society. And then a number of them were just like the moderator happened to be a Baha'i. And then there was 2 towards the end that were specifically us trying to introduce a few ideas into the discourse. One was around constructive agency in response to oppression. And then one was trying to express, like one of the objectives of our work is learning how Baha'i experience can be relative to a national conversation on race. And so there was a panel that explored, it was called Nuclei of Change, that explored Baha'i contributions at the grassroots. But the first few days, so, just to maybe share a little bit about the themes and then how one of these panels came together, and hopefully then at the end, I'll share a clip. May was saying that the 2 big themes that we felt were like, again, those deeper level principles or questions that we were trying to explore was the question of participation, the nature of participation in the process of change. So what is the nature of change itself? So those are 2 big ideas that we were trying to explore. And then each day had its own theme. And so the first day, let me just pull up the website here so I can look. The first day was specifically looking at the relationship between justice and truth. And this is one area where we really wanted to, we felt that this question of the relationship between justice and oneness was another big question that we had coming into our role in this. And then like one way that we could find a practical expression of this was this idea of truth and reconciliation, that by looking at the truth, especially in terms of history, we would be able to, it was an expression of justice that we had maybe not been able to really fully understand and appreciate collectively as a nation, our history with racism. And so we wanted to emphasize this question of truth, narrative, and history as an expression of justice. But then we also wanted to explore the path towards reconciliation as an expression of oneness. And so the panels on that day were one from community organizers who were working around restorative justice and reparations, but who understood the concept of healing as a bridge to repair, healing and repair as a bridge towards reconciliation. And so that was the first panel. And then the second panel that day was looking at efforts around truth and reconciliation and transformative healing. And so one was a woman who had done a lot of work in the Native American adoption field, where she was personally taken from her family, a Native family, and put it with a white family. And so she was working around truth and reconciliation efforts in that area across the country. And then another person was working at the national level to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the national level, sanctioned by the U.S. government. So that was the first day. We explored this through them. And then the second day, we looked at the question of participation through the lens of solidarity. And we also looked at through the question of sort of grassroots community change. And so the first panel was a collection of historians, Barbara Fields, who is a professor of history at Columbia University, Adam Rothman is a professor of history at Georgetown, and Ted Johnson, who has written extensively about the question of solidarity for an organization in Washington called the Brennan Center for Justice. And so they really looked at this question of solidarity from different angles. And then in the afternoon, we had some folks from community organizing efforts, primarily in Detroit, elsewhere, but primarily in Detroit, and what was called the Bog Center. And so we really got to dig into sort of local community building efforts, but they were able to also raise it up to a larger connect that to a conceptual conversation on participation and transformative change. So they really were actually exploring this question of the twofold moral purpose, which is so fundamental to the work that we do in the community through the Institute process. And then the final day was another key theme that we really feel like we want to explore and contribute to the conversation on race, is that the relationship or coherence between means and ends, that the ends that we seek should be coherent with the means that we take to approach them. And so that was a chance to explore the question of constructive agency, and then also look at some of the community building efforts of the Baha'i community, bringing some friends who were working at the neighborhood level. So it was a really rich conversation. And if it's okay, what I'll do now is just share a clip from one of the sessions. It's the session that I mentioned on solidarity with Adam Rothman, Barbara Fields, and Ted Johnson. And maybe we'll offer a few reflections afterwards about the history of that, how that panel came to be.
Just a couple of things that that have been on my mind to say. And one of them is something that Jim Hightower, who publishes that marvelous newsletter, The Hightower Lowdown, has a habit of quoting something that his father always used to say. Everybody does better when everybody does better. And it is very hard to get Americans to understand that as a working principle. As long as we seem to have a conception of justice, even those of us who are most concerned with justice because we're most aware of where it's denied, we seem to have a habit of what Adolph Reed has called disparity thinking when we think about justice. So justice, if you take that way of looking at things to its logical terminus, then Black people will have achieved justice if they are, when unarmed and innocent, uncharged with a crime, shot dead by the police in exactly the proportion that they make up of the population. And when white people are shot dead by the police in the proportion that they make up of the population. As soon as I put it like that, it's obvious to everybody, that's not what we're after. We don't want injustice and exploitation and cruelty and inhumanity to be visited on people in the proportion that they represent of the population. We want to get rid of those things. And what Adam and I were talking about in our article, and what we do in our work, along with many other historians, is focusing on those aspects of our history that have made justice impossible. And I, in my writing and in my teaching, am especially concerned to get some of the notions out of the way that are just derailing. And one of them, I practically break out in hives every time I hear the expression racial justice, for example. And I tell my students that racial justice is to justice as half-truth is to the truth. Half-truth isn't a kind of truth, it's a lie. Racial justice isn't a kind of justice. It is a type of injustice. And so I would like to banish it. My students know that they're going to get a squiggly line if they use that expression in their papers. And I think it needs to go, because racial justice, when you think about it, and this is an insight that I got many years ago from another of my students, racial justice is exactly what segregationists considered themselves to be administering. The justice that's appropriate for Black people. We don't need that.
I've read Barbara and Karen Fields make this very point in Racecraft, and I've heard Barbara talk about it, and I think I understand it. And I just want to emphasize how difficult it is to make that point today, because the language of the phrase racial justice is everywhere.
Yes.
And it seems like such a progressive aspiration. We all want racial justice, but there is Barbara's identifying a real problem with that concept, which is that it carves off a certain domain of life as particular to Black people. And it makes it easier for the rest of us to say that has nothing to do with me. Why should I care about racial justice as a white person? Because it's not about me. That's one of the problems that way of thinking about the problem of justice poses. Black people getting shot by the police at disproportionate rates is a problem of justice more than it is a problem of racial justice. And when you think about it as a problem of injustice, you can also see how other people are drawn into that problem, like Hannah Pfizer. Unfortunately, the shooting of Hannah Pfizer is not an issue of racial justice. And that allows people all over the place to ignore it. It was an enormous injustice and something that should be attended to. And it also provides the possibility for all of us seeing ourselves as having a stake in this issue.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What I love about this conversation is that we're talking about the actual meaning of words and not the bumper sticker meaning that the public tends to assign these words. So if you think about, if we were to solve racial justice tomorrow, that does not mean we have a just society. It just means, as Barbara said, we have reduced disparities between the type of justice that white people receive and the type of justice that people of color receive. The same can be said for inequality, socioeconomic inequality writ large. Racial, if we achieve racial equality tomorrow, it does not mean we've achieved gender equality or equality between those who are able and those who are disabled. So these words mean are more expansive than we often consider them to be in public conversation. And that said, that there is, in my view, some utility in drawing attention to disparities between groups, especially when we talk about what public policy can do about these things. A lot of the problems we have in this country are not problems of policy, but of character, of our willingness or unwillingness, ability or inability to see people who are different from us as equal to us and as deserving of life, liberty, pursuits of happiness as we are. And so public policy can help us address some of the experiences of these inequalities in our nation, but they do not solve the problem of inequality, because that is a broader and a much deeper sort of individual and collective effort. So this is sort of a yes and in agreement with everything that's been said.
Yeah, so first of all, maybe just to clarify again that the panels, the audience for this symposium were the contacts that we're making from the wider society, and most of the panelists themselves were not Baha'is, they're coming from the wider society. So in this case, the Shahrazad Sabet, who didn't speak in that session, in that clip, was the only Baha'i on that panel. And I think, just to note that there's just a lot behind that clip, right? Like a lot behind that panel, and that, Adam is someone that we met several years ago when we went to an event that we thought was interesting. We introduced ourselves to him and then fostered a really meaningful relationship. We've hosted a few other events with him. And then as we were planning this panel, we found out that or we really wanted Barbara Fields, who was sort of a leading thinker on racial justice, race in America. She wrote a book called Racecraft with her sister. And she was like one of those people we'd love to have on the panel. And then as we reached out to Adam to tell him about this panel, he said, I think a great person to have on this panel is Barbara Fields. I'm friends with her. I'd like to invite her. We said, fantastic. And she said yes, and that's how she ended up on the panel. And then Ted was someone actually who came in last minute, who we've had a really wonderful relationship with over the last few years, just deepening in conversation. We check in with each other every few months just to share ideas. What are we thinking about? What are we learning? And we kind of help each other grow in that way. And so he came and joined us. And I think one really interesting, well, I'll save that last point, but just to note, like in that clip, you really saw, you know, some of the ideas that we mentioned that we wanted to really have be explored at the symposium were brought up. The question of language, the question of truth, and the question of the importance of spiritual principles, to describe them as moral capacities, as just as important as policy, and as just important as policy. So it was just sort of like that. None of that was planned or scripted, but it just represents, I think, the ongoing conversation that we're having with these different folks, who over time, I think, you know, it starts to just have an impact. So there's a few thoughts in relation to your question, Ken, and I don't know if you wanted to ask another, or if May had some.
We're about 40 minutes into the session now, so perhaps we could go ahead and transition into whatever commentary or reaction our viewers may have. But I'll just exercise the prerogative of the chair and throw out the first question, and that is that the Universal House of Justice has described our engagement in the discourses of society as taking place at several levels. I mean, one, of course, is the international level, and we have the Baha'i international community that leads that on behalf of the World Center. We have discourses at the national level, which of course you are very involved in under the auspices of your National Spiritual Assembly. But there are also discourses that emerge in the work of community building, and discourses in which local spiritual assemblies take part, and which individuals engage in as the result of their contacts or social networking, or even in their professions, where they have these opportunities to advance the conversation on any number of issues. And so a question for me is, what approaches or concepts in your experience might be useful for our viewers to think about in their own engagement and discourse?
Yeah, I guess I can get us started. I think first and foremost, like, you know, in order to really be able to learn to be able to participate in a discourse, we have to understand how that discourse works and operates. We have to understand, you know, what are the major themes, how do they interact with each other, who are some of the thinkers, and in some cases, especially if it's our profession, you know, that is relatively easy for us to engage in. We have experience thinking, interacting with a certain group of people, exploring a certain type of concepts. And then I think to go along with that, we also have to develop our capacity to, and I think this is really helpfully laid out by the Universal House of Justice in the July 22nd message, is we have to be able to, I'm going to badly paraphrase my own words, but
May, just because we have viewers who might not be from the United States, you might want to say a little more context.
Yes, the Universal House of Justice message to the American Bahá'í community, written July 22nd of last year. And it was basically helping the American Bahá'í community think about this moment of what they call a moment of historical portent, because of the issues, the resurgence of the conversation around racism after the killing of George Floyd, that, you know, it was a guidance to help us think about how to navigate that issue. But also, in addition to this question of racism, it can be applied to a variety of discourse areas, which is that we have to develop the capacity to, what I'm going to call, like, filter a conversation through the lens of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. Not every conversation that happens in our work and in a discourse that we might find ourselves connected to is something that the ideas are useful, are something that's in line with what we think as Baha'is. So we have to be able to recognize those elements of a discourse where we really have something to contribute that's in line with our framework. And sort of let the elements that are not go, and not try to force something that doesn't fit. And so we have to be constantly, you know, it helps to do that in conversation with others, which is, you know, nice for PJ and I working together, but also, you know, of course, the Association for Baha'i Studies is creating spaces for or for individuals who are in the same field to come together to learn to read their field together and think about how we as Baha'is can make a contribution to the advancement of understanding in that field. And then of course in the neighborhood, we're also in our conversations with our neighbors, we're also thinking about what is the social reality of our neighborhood, and being drawn into conversations, whether it be like at neighborhood association gatherings or parent-teacher meetings, or PTA meetings, things like that. So I think the question is like, how do we do those two things of reading the reality and understanding what is a contribution from the Baha'i faith, what is in line with the faith. And then also, I think I mentioned this before, also like, how do we develop relationships with people, both also outside of the Baha'i community? That's how we really refine and practice what it is we want to share through, our relationships with others, and seeing what are ideas that have salience with people, that people feel like it is something that they can understand and apply. For PJ and I, like at the national level, one of the ways that we know, like, or we gauge whether we're making a contribution is when we hear ideas that we've offered shared back to us and not necessarily attributed to us. When we hear sometimes from our colleagues that someone has mentioned a space that we've organized as being very helpful, or idea that they recognize as having roots in the Baha'i faith shared by someone else. So I think the idea is that these concepts, this revelation, we know it's something that just belongs to us, so that we are trying to share liberally and not necessarily with attribution. But I don't know if PJ, you also want to add something.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I would add is just in terms of like having an opportunity to reflect on what this might look like for you personally. There's the 14th book in the sequence of courses is related to participating in public discourse. And it's nice that the very opening section, it sort of frames it as that this is an extension of a capacity that we start to develop even in the first book, like being able to invite people to a devotional gathering. Like that requires a capacity to have a conversation that brings to bear spiritual principles into a situation, into a relationship that you have with someone. It entails relationship building. It entails creating a social space that people come together, that they feel welcome in, that they can contribute to, their thoughts and ideas are heard and shared. And then, as you go through all of the books in the sequence, all of the things that we're being trained to do, what we're learning how to do, all the capacities we're building are expressed in conversation. And then another step then is that this becomes maybe a little more formalized, right? Like, what are the formal spaces where the conversations are unfolding in your neighborhood, in your city, in your town, and trying to be present in those spaces. I think the city of, like, just one simple example was that the city of Charlotte was exploring possibilities of reparations and reparative justice. And so the local spiritual assembly reached out to our office to see if they could, sign on to a letter of support for this effort, and be present at city council meetings when this proposal was being discussed. So you could see, in that case, a Baha'i institution at a local level was reading the reality, seeing that this issue is of great concern, and that there were opportunities to engage in it in a constructive way through this effort at City Hall, which they felt it was a constructive effort that was bringing in different parties and it wasn't divisive. So they were part of it. So I think that's just like one small example, but also, working with junior youth groups or study circles, there's ways in which the conversations that are had there can lead to analyzing what's happening in the community and seeing where you might be able to start contributing ideas.